Good morning, MacLaren. It is Wednesday, December 9th, 2020. The weather today is sunny with a few afternoon clouds, a high of 62. Winds will be southwest 5 to 10 miles per hour with a zero chance of rain. The sun rose at 7:06 a.m. and the sun will set at 4:37 p.m. Today we continue learning more about Ludwig van Beethoven. His father was a musician and wanted Beethoven to learn music too. When Beethoven was very young, before he could reach the keys on the clavier, his father demanded that young Beethoven should practice. And just so you know, the clavier was a keyboard instrument that was around before the piano was even invented. Was a small rectangular shaped box. As mentioned yesterday in our story, Beethoven's father was a rough man. He would scold young Beethoven harshly if he made a mistake. Poor young Beethoven would be crying as he was trying to play. After years of rigorous practice for long hours a day, Beethoven displayed great talent on the clavier as well as the violin. I will play another short piano composition that Ludwig van Beethoven wrote. It is called Tempest, which might reflect what was going on in young Beethoven's mind during these early years. February 4th, 1823. Dear Uncle, this afternoon a messenger arrived bearing a note for Mr. Beethoven. The messenger said to me, "This is from Prince Karl Lanowski. But the prince says that if Mr. Beethoven's door is closed, he is not to be disturbed. Mr. Beethoven must be a terrible man if even a prince is afraid of him. Your nephew, Christoph." February 15th, 1823. Dear Christoph, I've been thinking of your story about the prince. Christoph, I don't think the prince is afraid of Mr. Beethoven. I believe he is showing him respect. In Vienna, music is so loved that even a prince will tread carefully around a composer. Alas, Mr. Beethoven has not returned their kindness. He has not been gentle with the fine people of Vienna, and they have done everything they can to please him. Mr. Beethoven has always had rough manners. He turns down their invitations, dresses carelessly to visit, and arrives late for their dinners. Sometimes he is very angry if he is asked to play his music. There is one famous story of a grand lady who got down on her hands and knees one evening to beg Mr. Beethoven to play. He refused. And there is another tale about a prince who teased Mr. Beethoven for not playing at dinner. Mr. Beethoven flew into a rage. "There are many princes," he said, "but there is only one Beethoven." My belief, Christoph, is that a prince has more to fear from Mr. Beethoven than has a little boy. Affectionately, Uncle. February 26th, 1823. Dear Uncle, no news today but this. Do you remember I once told you about a stray dog who was whining on the street? He is a small and spotted dog, and I have found a way to make him stop crying. Today he seemed quite pleased to share my sugar cake for lunch. Christoph. March 2nd, 1823. Dear Christoph, I write again so soon because I have been making inquiries on your behalf. I spoke today with a man who once worked for Mr. Beethoven, copying out music for the players. He told me that Mr. Beethoven never stays in one home very long. He moves as often as 3 times a year. Sometimes Mr. Beethoven wants a sunnier home, sometimes shadier. Sometimes he says he cannot live on the ground floor. Then he cannot live on the top. And I hear he has been asked to leave from time to time as well. He has a restless nature. So perhaps before too long you will have your wish, and quieter people will be living upstairs. But in the meantime, tell me, is it true, as I have also heard, that Mr. Beethoven has 3 pianos in his room? Your uncle. March 10th, 1823. Dear Uncle, no, it is not true that Mr. Beethoven has 3 pianos. He has 4, and you should see them. To begin with, some of his pianos have no legs. He takes the legs off to move them and so that he can play them when he is sitting on the floor. That way he can feel his playing through the floorboards, which he must do because, of course, he can't hear. But it's surprising that his pianos can be played at all. Many of the strings are broken and curled up. They look like birds' nests made of wire. And the pianos are stained inside from the times he's knocked the inkwell with his sleeve. And Mr. Beethoven has all sorts of bells on his desk and trumpet ears and 4 trumpet ears to help him hear, and something called a metronome as well. It's a little box with a stick on it. The stick goes back and forth and tells musicians how fast they should play. Mr. Beethoven has a name for me. He calls me the little gatekeeper because I am always sitting outside on the step. Yours truly, Christoph, Gatekeeper. April 2nd, 1823. Dear Christoph, your letter about Mr. Beethoven's piano has reminded me that there was a time when Mr. Beethoven was more famous for his playing than his composing. When Mr. Beethoven first lived in Vienna, he would sit down with an orchestra to play his music without a single note written out. It was all in his head. And the music he played, his music was so beautiful that sometimes people who were listening would start to cry. But Mr. Beethoven would laugh at them and say, "Composers do not cry. Composers are made of fire." Now that Mr. Beethoven is deaf, of course, he plays the piano with the bumps and crashes you hear upstairs all day. And I have another story for you, a story people tell me about his deafness. One afternoon, Mr. Beethoven was out walking in the woods with a friend. A shepherd was playing a flute nearby. Mr. Beethoven's friend said, "Listen," and stopped to hear the flute. But Mr. Beethoven heard nothing, and so he knew that day that he was going deaf. When Mr. Beethoven was still a young man, he began to hear humming and buzzing in his ears. At first he couldn't hear high notes. Then he couldn't hear soft voices. How frightening it must have been for him, Christoph, and how alone that man who lives upstairs must feel. To hear Mr. Beethoven's story convinces me that I am the most fortunate man alive. Your uncle. Well, that's it for today. We'll continue more tomorrow. Okay, my friends, if it's your birthday today, Wednesday, December 9th, 2020, happy birthday. I hope you have a day filled with kindness, friendliness, and peace. See you next time.